I'm Liz. I'm a volunteer bat worker. I have had some working in the bat field as well before I retired and moved to Somerset, which I did in November last year. But I have had a few batty activities in Somerset before that. I have a big thank you to Ed Wells, who used to live in Ilminster until about 11 years ago, who has 4 decades worth of bat experience in Somerset and Ilminster particularly, and he has lent me his museum specimens, which are on display at the back. So at the break, if you'd like to have a look at any of those, please do. And he's given me a little info sheet about the bats in Ilminster specifically on some of the roosts that he knows. So if anyone's got particular questions about that, I can chat to you in the break. He's also done a few of the slides for me as well with the local data. So this evening, I'm going to try and keep to time. I could talk about bats all night, so I'm going to keep it to time. I'm just going to do a little bit of bat background. I'm sure there's plenty of you in here who already know an awful lot about bats, but it's nice to we all sort of start on the same page. I'll talk a little bit about the global diversity and their ecological importance. And then I'll bring it a bit closer to home. We'll talk about the British bats and their life cycle, and particularly some of the really rare and important bats that we see here in Somerset. We'll touch on a few things that we as individuals can do for bats. And then during the break, I'll leave a little bit of a video of some bats coming out of their roost on screen, and you can also have a look at those specimens at the back. And there's a book that if you're interested in the diversity of bats, you can have a look at some of those in more detail, because I haven't got time to go through all of them tonight. So, what are bats? Well, they're mammals, so they give birth to live young like we do, and they suckle their young, but they are the only mammal that can truly fly, which makes them incredibly remarkable. They are the order Chiroptera, which means hand wing, and we can see from these fossilised remains that they've got these enormously long fingers, and it is in fact their fingers that are covered with a sort of skin-like membrane that makes their wings. So that makes them very agile as flyers. So we know that bats have been around on this planet for a very, very long time. This particular fossil was found in Germany in some shale beds, and this dates back 30 to 40 million years. And these bats were echolocating as well as flying all the way back then. More recent, older fossil remains, we've got one here, which is the oldest one that I know of, which is 52 million, it's been dated 52 million years, was found in Wyoming, so in America. So we've got some fossilised remains in Germany, we've got fossilised remains elsewhere in Europe and across America. So they already back then, they were diversifying and covering huge different areas of the planet. So they have over time diversified even further. So they're quite an interesting species, or range of species to study. But the bats aren't blind. We all think of that phrase when we think about bats. What's the first thing we think about? Well, blind as a bat. Just because they fly around at night doesn't mean to say they haven't got very good eyesight. In fact, they've got better eyesight than I have, most of them. But they do use ultrasound to navigate at night. And I've got a little clip, just so you can hear what their bat sounds kind of sound like. They make these series of pulses of air as they expel air as their wings beat. And these calls range in different frequencies. Different bats have different call signatures. And then they hear those sounds coming back to them, and they tell them a lot about the environment around them. And that particular sound was the sound of a pipistrelle. So if you're out with a bat detector, tuned to heterodyne, and you're wandering around, you hear that sort of slapping sound, that's one of our pipistrelle species. They're also incredibly social animals. They live in colonies. The mothers all come together in what's called maternity roosts. They help each other out. There's evidence of some bats feeding each other if they've not fed before. So the vampire bat must feed within sort of 48 hours. If it doesn't, it's at risk of dying, so bats that have come back from a foraging event will regurgitate blood and feed other vampire bats. But if those bats don't kind of reciprocate, then they'll be ostracised and people will not, the other bats won't feed them, so they'll kind of get nudged out. So they've got some quite complex social structures. And because they are such an incredible, diverse range of species, they're protected, and they're protected globally. There are some areas where they're considered pests and they don't receive the same level of protection. But Great Britain has signed up to international agreements to protect, monitor and conserve bats. And on the 1st of April, I checked the website that registers all our mammals in the world. And at that point, there were 1,527. It might have gone up since then. So there's genetics and a lot of research is going on all of the time, which describes new species. But just because the numbers are going up of the species doesn't mean to say they're all doing very well. They've all faced some huge declines in the past, and with climate change and changes of landscape use, pesticides, all kinds of things, they are really struggling. So I've talked about diversity from a sort of historical point of view. I thought I'd just sort of start and show you a few little bits as to how wide-ranging bats are. And I thought I'd start with the smallest and the largest. So here we've got the little kitty hognose bat, and it's also known as the bumblebee bat because it is the size of a bumblebee. So they weigh less than 2 grams. They're usually about 1.5 grams. They're a little insect feeding bat that lives in Thailand. On the other extreme, we've got this golden-crowned flying fox, a fruit-eating bat that lives in Philippines, and its wingspan is bigger than I am tall. So quite an impressive beast to see flying around. And they can weigh nearly 2 kilograms. So they're a bit of a chunky monkey on the other extreme. And here's just a random selection of some of my favourites. So we've got some really beautiful, cute ones, and then the 100-year-old, the wrinkle-faced bat, is perhaps only his mother could love, I don't know. But there's, when I've practiced this talk, I've gone into a lot of detail about all of these bats, and I ran out of time, so I'll just skip over that, but if there's any that appeal to you, do ask me later. So we've got this huge diversity of bats around the place, but what do they do for us? And as 70% of all bat species are insectivores of one nature or another, pest control is one of the first things that comes to mind. And here in Britain, the common pipistrelle I have a lot of time for because all of the pipistrelle family eat small flying insects, mostly mosquitoes and midges, and each individual little 4 to 6 gram bat gets way through about 3,000 mosquitoes and midges a night. So just think of a world without pipistrelles. Wouldn't be good, would it? But, you know, on a financial basis, which they think of a lot in places like America, someone decided to quantify financially the value of bats. So this cave here is Bracken Cave. It's probably one of the most famous roosts in the world, and it's home to around about 1.5 to 2 million Mexican free-tailed bats every summer. And these bats really, really like a couple of types of moths. And those moths feed on corn crops and cotton crops. So someone quantified the amount of these moths a night that these bats would get through, and they came up with a figure of 200 tons a night. And when this is 10 years ago they did this study, over 10 years ago. And at that point, it equated to a saving of over $3.5 billion a year in pesticides. When you think of the volume that pesticide must be, the reduction in pollution and chemical residues is phenomenal. More recently, there was some infant mortality in North America, which was alarmingly increasing in an area, and they couldn't work out what it was, and there were researchers looking at all kinds of environmental factors. And it wasn't until someone said, well, hang on a minute, the bats are dying from white nose syndrome, let's look at the bat data. And it turned out that the massive declines in the bat populations due to the white nose syndrome correlated to this increase in infant mortality. They looked in it further, and it was due to the massive increase in pesticides that had been used agriculturally in that area. And that equated to over, I think it was about 1,523 deaths of young children. So bats are incredibly important. But it's not just insects. Okay, that's 70% are insect eaters, but there's a lot that eat other things. And the fruit-eating bats make some incredibly rich guano. All bat guano tends to be quite nutrient-rich and a good fertiliser. But there's people that go in and harvest guano from bat caves. But even better still, these bats are going around munching all this fruit, eating all these seeds, wrapping the seeds up in a nice nutrient-rich fertiliser, and then dropping them on the landscape as they fly by. And they're responsible for huge amounts of reforestation and forest regeneration. And when we think of pollinators, most people think of bees, maybe butterflies, but there's another bee, the bat, that is also really important in pollination, along with other things in the world as well. And we know now that there's over 528 different types of plants that are either solely reliant on bats or heavily reliant on bats for pollination. And 300 of those types of plants are fruit-bearing plants. And many of them are for fruits that we would like to enjoy. My favourite there being the chocolate. We owe a lot to our bats. But it's not just the ecosystem services they provide. Researching bats has given humans a lot of scientific discoveries too. So both of these graphs show the same kind of thing. Along the x-axis at the bottom, we've got body mass. And along the y-axis going up, we've got their longevity or their lifespan. And we can see that bats are way above the curve on these graphs. Humans are up there too, because we're learning all the time and we've got lots of medicines and various things to help keep us alive. But generally speaking, we think of something that's really small and tiny, high metabolism, lives fast, dies young, things that are big and heavy, slow lifestyle, slower metabolism, much longer lifestyle. But these little 6-gram bats can live 40-odd years. And they don't have a slow metabolism. When they're flying, they can have a heart rate of over 1,000 beats per minute, which is absolutely ridiculous. Now, they do go into torpor and perhaps lower their heart rate down to about 4 to 20 beats per minute, but even then, that doesn't explain quite how they live so long. So people have been looking into their immune system, which is very different to us, less aggressive on their cells than our immune systems, which are very inflammatory. But also they've discovered that bats repair their DNA. So as we go through our lives, our cells replicate, and in that replication process, we lose bits of DNA off the ends of the chromosomes, the bits called telomeres, and bats repair that. So they've now discovered some of the proteins and enzymes that are involved in that cell repair mechanism, and then use that. But you think how big an industry, these face creams and all the malarkey that go with it, to our quest for eternal youth. The bats are proving to be quite informative there. And, as are bats for medicines. And, poor vampire bats get a really bad rap. But this guy is cute. You've got to say. Very cute, very sweet. And it's these vampire bats, this is the common vampire bat, Desnodus rotundus. Their saliva has a really, really potent anticoagulant because they lick blood from the surface of the skin. So they want that blood to keep flowing, they don't want it to clot. So they've got this great anti-clotting factor in their saliva, and that has now been synthesised to make drugs which replace drugs such as warfarin, which have awful side effects. So, bringing us back to the bats themselves rather than what they can do for us. So I thought if you, after tonight, you fancy going out and seeing bats, it's quite good to be able to understand, what they're up to at different times of the year in order to get the best chances of seeing them. So I'll start with now. So we're now in that March, April, springtime time, and the bats are out fattening themselves up. So here we've got a greater horseshoe bat catching himself a nice yellow underwing moth. And so they're coming out of torpor. They've lost a little bit of their body condition because they've been through a time where there's very little feeding opportunities, and they need to get themselves fattened up ready for that summer season. The females particularly, they were mated back in the autumn, so they want to know whether they can progress their pregnancies. And they're not going to do that unless their bodies are in great condition, because if you're going to give birth to something that's a third of your body weight, that's like giving birth to a toddler for the females here. You really have got to invest an awful lot to grow that fetus until that point that it is at a stage that you can actually give birth. So there's a lot of retaining your body condition to be done. So these females all start congregating together, usually around about May time. And here we've got de Benton's maternity roost. And you can see they're really closely packed together. They're keeping each other really warm, so they're not having to use extra calories to keep themselves warm. And then come June and July, we get the pups, and they arrive. And this is a pipistrelle pup. And at the back in the museum specimens, there is a bit of a growth chart of the pipistrelle from a few days old to full size. So they're born blind and furless, as you see, and they're very reliant on their mum for the first couple of weeks where they're fed. So the mum will have to carry it around as she flies to feed herself. But then they'll start parking them in the maternity roost. So they kind of like get little nurseries, and some of the mums will go off and feed, and then they'll kind of take turns. And sometimes some mums might go roost elsewhere just to get some peace and quiet, because those roosts can get really smelly and noisy. And the boys tend to stay away. Very rarely see males around maternity roosts. Occasionally you might get last year's young that got a bit lost, but otherwise they generally stay well away. And the de Benton's males have been showing social distancing to stop getting things of various coronaviruses for many years before we got COVID and discovered social distancing. So come August, but after about 6 weeks, the pups can fly and they can forage for themselves. So they start getting independent. The young boys kind of go off and get themselves into all kinds of trouble. The girls tend, I think, probably follow their mums around because they don't come into care as often as the boys do that get themselves into some strange roosting positions. So they start going off and exploring. In sort of late July, August time, you might see bats flying in tandem. So your mums will kind of lead the pups around, show them how to forage and where they're going and stuff. Come August time, it gets to like festival season. So we need to make sure there's some good genetic flow. So the bats kind of travel huge distances to these swarming sites, which are generally associated with the best hibernation roosts. And they congregate in mass groups. And there's usually a lot more males than there are females, to be fair. The females, I think, just come and kind of leave after the deeds have been done. But they do are around those hibernation sites. So we think it's a really important process for showing the young of the year where the important roosts are for the winter. And they will, bats will be seen at different swarming sites on the same night. So they tend to swarm usually midnight onwards. So they'll go out and feed first and then go to the swarm sites. So that was a myotis flying around swarming. This is another myotis, it's same species, the Natura's bat. And it's found its nice little roost in a cave or an underground mine or something like that. And they find a little space and they kind of just shimmy into it. And their hibernation roosts, they want them to be cold, at a constant temperature, and damp. Because you don't want to wake up to have to go drink if you can, because it takes them 45 minutes to get out of torpor, uses a huge amount of energy, and energy equates to having to go feed. So although they do wake up and move around, they want to keep that to the minimum. So it's really important that these sites aren't disturbed, because you don't want to wake them up unnecessarily. But they tend to like around about 7 degrees, so they can really lower their body temperature, lower their heart rate. Their heart rate can go down as low as 2 to about 20 beats per minute, so, you know, really, really low, and they can conserve energy that way. So historically, you know, before we humans were on the planet, bats were roosting in trees and in caves and rock faces and cracks. But since we've started building houses, you know, might as well use those because they've replaced a lot of the places they would normally be. This is a roost that the Somerset Bat Group monitor. I think it's Hestercombe House in their stables. And this is home to 2 maternity roosts of 2 different species. So we've got a lesser horseshoe roost in there and a soprano pipistrelle roost. And these sort of louver windows are perfect for horseshoes because horseshoes like to fly directly into their roosts. They've got really long, quite delicate legs and they can't really sort of crawl around on them, whereas the other species are quite happy crawling or shimmering into little crevices. Pipistrelles and other species might just find a little gap, like a little lifted tile, or a bit of fascia board if there's a little gap. They only need something about half the size of my thumb to be able to sort of shimmy into. And they don't make nests, they can't change their roosts, so they need lots of different roosts with different environmental conditions so that they can find a roost that matches their needs at the time. But bats still need trees. This is a woodpecker hole in a tree. There's lots of features on trees that are important to bats, from lifted bark to tear outs, rot holes. Anything that gives a little cavity or a space will appeal to one species of bat or another. So different species of bat have different preferences. You'll see later, the other bit of video I've got is the barbastelle maternity roost that likes a piece of lifted bark to roost underneath. There were about 30 odd bats came out of that hole when we filmed it. But you'll find things, bats like noctules, a bigger bat, much bigger bat, like woodpecker holes too. But you know, they're quite often competing with things like squirrels that also quite like those kind of holes. So, what can we find in Somerset? Well, in Britain, we have 18 known species of bat. In Somerset, we have 16 of those, which makes Somerset one of the most bat-rich counties in the whole of the United Kingdom. So pretty special, to say the least. In fact, that's possibly the reason I moved to Somerset. Truth be known, it was the Leicester Horseshoe, but yeah, it was the bats that brought me here. But with 18 different species of bats, that makes bats represent over a third of all different types of mammals that we have in the United Kingdom. So they are, you know, punching well above their weight again as being important in our mammal communities. But because they've got wings, we don't often see them. And then when we do see them, we can't really see very much of them because they're just flitting around at night. So I thought I'd just give you some nice little photos so you could actually get a little bit more up close and personal with our bats. So starting over the top here, we've got the pipistrelle. So this is a common pipistrelle, but we also have soprano pipistrelles and Nethusis pipistrelles. And I think before long, we'll also have the Coul's pipistrelle. Somerset is famous in scientific world for the distinguishing between common pipistrelles and soprano pipistrelles as being discrete species. So there's a couple of roosts close by to here where Professor Kate Jones came when she was doing one of her research projects, and she took wing samples from these common pipistrelles and discovered that they weren't all common pipistrelles. Some were the common pipistrelle and some were the soprano pipistrelle. But they're really difficult to tell apart in the hand. They've got tiny little difference in their noses and a couple of other things. So without the genetics, we wouldn't know. There was a few people a bit suspicious that they didn't quite behave the same way. Then we have come to the grey long-eared bat, and this is the focus of the Somerset Bat Group's current research. The grey long-eared bat is a species that's extremely rare in Britain. In fact, it's probably one of our most rare bats in the whole of the United Kingdom. They were quite common in Jersey, where I was before, because Jersey's kind of the north part of its range. So with climate change, we may well see a lot more of these. But there have been a few males caught, and some have come into care in Somerset. So we're trying to find if there are maternity roosts of this bat in the area. But there is another species of long-eared bat, which looks almost identical to the grey long-eared bat, called the brown long-eared bat, and we have loads of those. They live in woodland and in buildings, and they're fairly widespread. Then we have the noctule, which is a big bat. It's sort of about three times the size of your pipistrelle. And it has a cousin called the liceless bat, so they're very, very similar. The liceless slightly looks similar, but has a much sort of lion's mane, ruff of fur, very long fur around its neck. The echolocation calls are really similar, and they look quite similar, so you do need to be a bat specialist to tell them apart. But the noctule is a big bat, and it flies really, really high, but it's one of the first bats you'll see in the evening. So if you look up and see a big bat high above you, the chances are it's a noctule. And because their echolocation calls are quite loud and very low frequency in the scheme of things for bats, some human beings can actually hear them. So that's quite possibly one. And if you're walking around a woodland and hear a strange noise coming out of a woodpecker hole in an oak tree, chances are that's a noctule roost, and there's a little bit of social chatter going on there because they like to have a little chat before they emerge to go foraging. So directly underneath the noctule is the serotine bat, and again that's quite a big bat, and there's a specimen again at the back there. And they sound very similar to the noctules. On bat detectors, they've got a slight different rhythm to their calls, so they're quite difficult to tell apart. In the hand, they look like an enormous common pipistrelle, but has a tiny little bit of free tail at the end of their tail membrane. Somerset is incredibly important for the serotine. We have far more serotines than most other counties seem to encounter them. Personally, I think there's a link with climate change again here. There's a virus that they carry that matches a virus that's carried in bats in Brittany. And I've noticed in Jersey before I came over here, we were getting more and more serotine. So I think they're kind of moving more northerly. The sort of the French bats are moving more northerly. There are bats that have been, serotines that have been in Britain for a long time. I think that might be adding to our mix. But there's a PhD being undertaken at the moment at University of Sussex, which hopefully will provide some answers on that. Then moving back into the middle, we've seen this photo of the swarming natterers before. So natterers are a family of bat called myosis bats, and they're the mouse-eared bats, so they tend to have longer ears than the pipistrelles. And the two species of bats that Somerset doesn't have are two of the myotis family. One is the greater mouse-eared bat, which is very, very rare. It almost went extinct until a single male was found about 30 years ago in a tunnel in West Sussex. And then last year or the year before, another couple of individuals have been found. So maybe it's having come back, maybe they're moving back from Europe, we're not sure. But so it's very unlikely we'll get one here in any time soon. But the other species of myotis bat that we don't have here is the alcathoe, and that's one of the small myotis bats, so it's very tiny. And there's two other species, the whiskered and the Brandt's bat, which together they're grouped together because most people can't tell them apart. So we have the whiskered Brandt's and alcathoes. So it's possible that we've picked up Brandt's or whiskered here that have actually been alcathoe, but it's also, they're very rarely encountered, the alcathoe, so who knows? We may or may not find them here. But in Somerset, we are punching well above our weight with our very diverse range of myotis species and all the rest of the bats. The other species that we looked at earlier in the maternity roost, the Daubenton's, is part of this myotis family. And I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. So I always think of the Daubenton's bat as a hobbit bat, because they have these enormous hairy feet, and they use their hairy feet to scoop insects from the surface of the water. So if you're out on an evening and you're seeing bats swooping down onto the water surface, that's probably a Daubenton's. And then in the corner here, we've got a very handsome greater horseshoe. And the horseshoes are really rare, and Somerset is really a hotspot for horseshoe bats, particularly the lesser horseshoe, which I'll introduce you to in a minute. But the greater horseshoe bat faced enormous declines back in the 60s and 70s due to timber treatments, as did the lessers, but they're beginning to bounce back now. We are seeing increases in the greater horseshoes. That might be to the detriment of the lessers, because they do like some of the same roosting features. And if the lessers move in, if the greaters moved in, the lessers do kind of move out a bit. And there's possible predation, which is being studied as well. Because there's a massive difference in size. The greater horseshoe bat is a big, chunky pear kind of size, and your lesser is about the size of a tiny plum. So there's a big difference in size. So this is one of the Myotis family, and I'm just going to take you through 3 of the really rare bats that we are lucky enough to have in Somerset. So this is one of the mouse-eared bats. It almost looks like a long-eared bat because its ears are so long. And this is the Bechstein's bat. And it's a woodland specialist. It's associated with ancient woodland, and they need tree features. They live in trees. And they're quite specific to the kind of features that they need. And unfortunately, trees of that age are becoming less and less common. So I don't know if any of you saw a couple of, I think it might have been last summer or the summer before, there was a piece recorded at Montacute House where they were veterinising some of the chestnut trees and putting features into the branches. So they're sort of cracking a couple of branches to put some sort of tear-outs into them. And they were making sure that these tear-outs were the right kind of size and shape and the right kind of angles that the Bechsteins go for. So we'll wait and see how effective that is. But there's a big project by the Bat Conservation Trust that focuses on 2 species, the Bechstein and the Barbster. And this is Barbster, and I'll introduce you to Barbie in a minute. But this data is a little bit old, it's 2022, but Ed very kindly gave me this slide because it does show quite nicely how South Somerset is really, really important for these Bechstein's bats, because all of these blue dots, and might be a few green ones there as well, show where roosts have been found or individuals have been located. So these have been done by bat specialists, because obviously you do need to probably have the bat in the hand or very close to be able to identify it to species level. So this is my lesser horseshoe, my favourite. Their echolocation calls are out of this world. If you've got a heterodyne bat detector and you're anywhere near a lesser horseshoe roost, the sound is magical. I even managed to hook my husband into bats outside a lesser horseshoe roost in Somerset. He agreed to move to Somerset. So, but they're tiny, they're so fragile. But instead of, most bats shout their echolocation out of their mouth. They use their wing beat to conserve energy and emit the sound as they beat their wings. But the horseshoes don't. They use that complicated nose leaf that they've got to emit a sound that is the perfect pitch for their best level of hearing. So their hearing is attuned to specific frequencies. And this bat is echolocating at 110 kilohertz. Now, we can just about hear the top teens in kilohertz. This is so way above it. And they're listening for the slight changes in frequency as the sound bounces back. And from that, because they're using Doppler effect, so if you're standing in the middle of the road, ambulance comes past, the tone and the speed of the sound coming towards you changes as it comes towards you and moves away. They're using that physical process to analyse the sounds to work out exactly what it is it's chasing, which direction and how fast their prey is going. So yeah, they're quite incredible little creatures. And as you can see, Somerset is their hotspot. And not only are we really important for a lot of their maternity roosts and their hibernation roosts, we're kind of central for a lot of communication with roosting colonies elsewhere. So Somerset is the place for lesser horseshoe bats. And this is Barbie. This is our Barbastelle bat. She's small, or he's small. Really, really dark fur. So difficult bat to see. We did find one in our hibernation survey not far from here earlier this year, roosting up a tiny crack, and a few people missed it, so I had to go back and have a look. But their little ears meet on the top of their head, and they've got kind of like a little pug face, so they're quite a cute bat, but incredibly, incredibly rare. And it's only in recent times where researchers really, really searched for these bats, we've started to find them a little bit more. They're associated with ancient woodland, and their breeding sites are underneath bits of lifted bark, so their maternity roosts don't last very long. Bats are loyal to their roosts. They tend to use the same roosts year after year after year, but a piece of lifted bark isn't going to have the same thermal properties for several years, and it's going to come off and it's going to go. So, they are very, very vulnerable species. But I've got a little bit of video for you to see later if you want to watch it in the break. But as you can see, again, we're doing really, really well for Barbastelles. So as a bit of fun, when I was on holiday in Somerset last May, I was doing a project for the government of Jersey using these bat detectors, and I ran out of time in work time to test them with their new firmware. So I brought them on holiday with me, and I thought, well, do you know what, rather than just sticking one out in my own garden, I'll see if I can rope a few volunteers in. So I went along to the RSPB group meeting and roped in a few of their volunteers to pop a bat detector out in their garden for a few nights and see what happened. So I put them all out, and rather than analyse all the sounds personally, because I didn't have the time to do that, the British Trust for Ornithology have an acoustic pipeline, and you can just upload your recordings, and they do some jiggery-pokery with artificial intelligence and send you a set of results, which I then need to look at to make sure they make sense. So any of the unusual ones I had to have a look at manually and confirm whether they were true or not. And in most cases, they were relatively good. There's always a few oddities. So basically, this is the detector. This tiny little bit there is the microphone, and it just sits out there and then comes on just before sunset, switches itself off just after sunrise, and then it's just listening out, and if it hears something that it thinks might be a bat, it records it. So it's quite a clever bit of kit. And these are where we put them. So you can see there's one right over Ilminster. So I thought I'd show you the results of that detector. So top of the list, brown rat, perfect. It's not a bat, but never mind. And we've got a house mouse, and we've got some unidentified birds. Now that always amuses me. It's the British Trust for Ornithology. Anyway, but we did have, 1,000 common pipistrelles. Well, we had 1,000 detections, over 1,000 detections of the common pipistrelle, and the downside with these devices is they're sitting in a field, and it could be the same bat just flying round and round and round, or it could be, 500 or 600 bats flying past. But the clever sound analysis software also picks out the feeding buzzes. So when a bat is feeding, it's emitting its pulses, but as it gets closer to its prey, it's kind of a little bit quieter because it doesn't want to kind of let them know it's after it. And the calls become so close together, it kind of makes this sort of raspberry sound, and that's known as a feeding buzz. And the software's been trained to pick those up too. So there were at least 71 feeding incidents in this garden, so it's quite cool. And they were picked up on every night that the detector was out there, because that detector was deployed for 8 nights. So it's pretty impressive. So we had lots of pipistrelles, and we had some of the soprano pipistrelles as well. There was definitely some serotine and some noctule flying past. Wasn't entirely convinced on the Lisla because it could have been either of those other two species. Their calls are somewhere between the two. But there was also long-eared bats, which is very exciting. And when I looked at the calls, they did actually look, most of the ones that they came up as grey long-eared looked like grey long-eared. Having said that, they are very, very, very similar. So I wouldn't bet my life on it. I would be highly suspicious that they were grey long-eared bats. So that was pretty cool from this particular detector. And the other bits of the results that the BTO give us is a nice little breakdown of how activity varies per night. So we can see that the middle nights of that sampling period by far the more prolific. So when I saw sort of a few graphs like this, I thought, well, I'll compare them, but each different site had their own nights that were better, so it wasn't really related to the weather particularly. So it must have just been some good insect availability in their gardens at that particular time. So that was just a bit of fun. It wasn't a scientific study, but if we want to do something for bats, then we really need to do some scientific research. And as I mentioned, the government have actually signed up to these international agreements, and we are duty-bound to do research and monitoring. So the Bat Conservation Trust does this on behalf of the government, and anyone can help and participate in those studies by taking part in some of their studies that are available online. You can sign up and they get instructions and training on how to get involved. But the most important thing I think that anyone can do, if you've got even the tiniest bit of garden, is to think about gardening in a wildlife-friendly way. Bats are indicator species. They're kind of at the top of that food chain. So if they're doing well, everything else is doing well. So if we look after our soil, we look after our plants, we have a good diversity of plants, we've got pollen and flowers available throughout the year, that we're feeding those insects from as soon as they're sort of out of their hibernation phases or, emerging from their early stages, that's going to be good for bats. So ponds, if you've got space for a pond, is brilliant. Night-scented flowers are great, but even just like a nice bit of wood pile in a corner, some rotting wooden vegetation, perfect. We can put up bat boxes. It's always good to give wildlife a home. If you've got a loose bit of fascia board, please don't get expanding foam. But be mindful of them. They are a protected species. If you do have bats using your home, as many of you probably will have living in Somerset, there is help available if you need to do renovation works or building works or repairs. The Bat Conservation Trust do have a whole cohort of volunteer bat workers who can provide advice and help you obtain the right licences so that you can do your work legally. But one thing that's often overlooked that affects all of our wildlife, and it affects human health too, is artificial light at night. And this is probably one of my biggest bugbears. In the last 30 years, light pollution has increased by 49%. Stops us seeing stars. It affects our sleep rhythms. It impacts the breeding cycles of insects. And it can entomb bats. If a light is shining on a bat roost and it's only got the one exit, it might be too scared to come out of its roost. So if that light is on night after night, those bats are going to die inside that roost. So, it's quite nice to have a little bit of outside light, but think about closing curtains, reducing light spill. If you have got lights on in the garden, have ones that are low-level lights, and just sort of spread the word. I think it's one of those things that with the advent of LEDs, it's so cheap, but those LED lights could be incredibly bright, and that white light is not good for our wildlife. And if you do, want to go batty, if you've been inspired by these magnificent creatures, you can join the Bat Conservation Trust or the local bat group. We're very amenable to people coming along and coming and seeing bats when we do research work. And one of the group has been building these bat detectors. So we had a little group over in Norton and Chiselborough with our nature network where we were building some bat detectors really, really cheaply, because the professional ones I use are thousands of pounds, whereas this cost me 20. So an absolute bargain, and I got to build it myself, which was even better. So I've got one to show you at the back. So the Somerset Bat Group do run these courses from time to time. So do have a look at that if you're interested, because if you can hear the bats flying around, it's much, much easier to see them, because if you can't hear that they're there, you're not quite sure where to look. Anyway, so this is barbastels roosting behind a bit of lifted bark, and there's about 20 of them in there, just over 20 of them in there. So before they can fly, their shoulder muscles need to be really, really warm. So they do this like little shivering to get themselves nice and warm, and then it'll start to pop out.